Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fuqua School of Business Distinguished Speaker Series. It is an incredible privilege to have Ken Frazier join us for the series this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are at this moment in time. But Ken probably is one of the people in the world who needs no introduction, but I'll give him a very brief one regardless. He is currently the executive chairman at Merck. He is the former CEO at Merck and had a 10-year run that culminated in being named by his peers as the CEO of the year. So an incredibly accomplished CEO. In addition to his role at Merck, he is the co-founder and co-chair of OneTen, which I imagine we'll talk about a little bit in the conversation. And is the lead director at Exxon, among many other things that he has done. Ken has been a role model in terms of thinking about what is the role of a CEO in this world that we live in, which is so polarized, which is so full of opportunities to weigh in on social issues. And he is one of the world's experts in this. At least by his experience in weighing in on these issues. He has told me to make sure that we keep this conversation real and not to not make it all about puffery and so on. And so he has definitely opened the door to having honest conversation and taking on tough questions. So Ken, it is just a real privilege to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bill. I'm looking forward to it.
So I will dial up the degree of difficulty of the questions, but let me start with one which really is more career focused, which is you actually began your professional life as a lawyer, and I've seen that you've claimed the most significant thing you've done in your life is to overturn a wrongful conviction of someone who is on death row. So how is it that you turned away from this practice when it's something that was so meaningful and significant to you?
So thank you for having me today. I'll jump right into the question. I am a lawyer, but not in the pejorative sense of the word. I did not ever really want to be a business lawyer as such. I graduated from law school. I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. I wanted to be a courtroom lawyer. And so I began to practice in areas where I could try cases, particularly cases for people who were disadvantaged. I grew up in a disadvantaged area of Philadelphia, and so that was the clientele I wanted to represent. And I did have this opportunity to represent a guy named Bo Cochran, who was on death row for 19 years for a crime that he didn't commit. I love that work. It's the best work that I ever did in terms of my personal feeling of fulfillment day to day. But you know, when you do that kind of work, you also have to pay the bills. And doing civil rights work didn't pay all the bills. I had a young family, so I spent some time representing companies. The good thing about representing disadvantaged people and people in criminal cases is I tried a lot of cases when I was young. And that made me valuable, frankly, to businesses, because most lawyers will litigate, but they don't actually try cases to juries. I began trying a lot of cases for Merck for a number of years. And at a particular point in time in the early 90s, when the industry was facing what was then called Hillary Care, when the Clintons were talking about drug pricing reform, the CEO of Merck called me into his office, and he knew I was the company's main trial lawyer. And he basically said, you know, you talk good. So why don't you come into the company and become, in essence, our spokesperson? Advocate on a bigger stage. He said, I'm about to retire in 2 years. A great CEO named Roy Vagelos, who's one of the greatest CEOs in the 20th century. And he said, I only have enough time to make one more person's career, and it's going to be your career. And so I would never have wanted to leave the courtroom. But the last thing is I was married to a woman who was a legal headhunter. And when I came home and told my wife, Andrea, that I'd been given this offer at Merck and I was going to turn it down, She said, maybe you might want to reflect on that before turning it down, because law partnerships are valuable, but there's this stuff in corporate America called stock options. And she said, you might want to think about that. And so with her advice, I tried it out going to Merck, and it seems to have worked out okay.
So when you were talked into transitioning into the business world, did you have this expectation then that you would be mentored and become the eventual CEO?
Absolutely not. And it's really, for me, when I talk about the opportunities that I've had in my life, I really think that I'm extremely fortunate. A number of things have happened to me that really didn't happen to the person to my left or my right as I was coming through life. One of which was, and I've talked about this before, growing up in the inner city of Philadelphia, but being bused to very good schools, gave me an opportunity early in my life educationally. But when I joined Merck, my goal was originally to join it as a lawyer. But as soon as I got there, my mentor, the CEO at the time, Roy Vigelo, saw things very differently. He said, you need to gain experience beyond being a lawyer. I want to give you an opportunity to learn what the company is about at its core. That wasn't what I wanted to do. In fact, I tried to turn that down, and he refused to let me turn it down. He believed that I had abilities that went farther than I thought I did. And that's, to me, the benefit of mentorship and sponsorship, was that he saw a potential path for me that was not limited by my legal background and forced me to broaden my opportunities and my skills beyond my comfort zone. So that sponsorship is what allowed me to go farther in my career than I ever imagined. And so I'm grateful for that sponsorship to this day.
So coming in as a lawyer to a company that is based on science, was there pushback against you from the Merck employees because, what does he know about the science of what we do?
Yeah, so absolutely there was. There's pushback because you're a lawyer to start with, and then there's pushback because you're a non-scientist. But one of the things that I think is really great about business is if you're open to learning, you can expand your knowledge base. And sometimes I tell younger people in Merck when they ask about career advice, I said, Merck is a company that has people who have very deep knowledge and expertise, but generally in relatively narrow areas. And so in a company like Merck, a lot of work has to happen horizontally between and among people who know a lot about a little. And there's value to having some people who know a little about a lot, because those people actually help integrate. They help the work that goes horizontally across the silos, as I put it. And I'll go back to what I did. When I graduated law school, most of my colleagues learned some deep area of legal expertise, like they became tax lawyers, or they became M&A lawyers, or labor lawyers. I had attention deficit disorder when I was growing up. And so I never wanted to be a lawyer who knew a lot about an area like antitrust. Being a courtroom lawyer, you don't really have to know a lot about anything. You just have to be able to persuade juries of what the right and wrong in the human dynamic of a case is. That's why when you look at Hollywood, one of the things that Hollywood loves is stories about courtroom lawyers. It's like emergency room physicians. Emergency room physicians aren't specialists at anything. They're just specialists at dealing with the emergency. And there's a similarity around courtroom lawyers. And when I came to Merck, I think that benefited me because I was willing to go from area to area and learn and not feel bad, because when I started, I knew a lot less than everybody else.
So when you became CEO, one of the first things you did was you invested heavily in R&D. And of course, this probably made you more popular with the scientific community within Merck, but it actually went against the kind of business trends in the pharmaceutical industry at that time. So you had companies like Valiant, who were pushing the whole idea of those big pharma companies, they're dinosaurs because they're wasting all this money. Now, things didn't work out so well for Valiant, but how did you how did you go against the trend in this very tough environment?
So I have to say that, again, this goes back to the importance of having mentors and role models. I mentioned that I was brought into the company by a terrific CEO, a man named Roy Vagelos, who, by the way, after he retired, went to another company called Regeneron and took its stock from $6 a share to over $700 a share because he focused on science. So my perspective of what Merck was as a company and what its role in the world was largely developed by working with the scientists inside Merck. And so when I became the CEO, you're absolutely right. At the end of 2010, when I became the CEO of Merck, the common perspective among Wall Street investors was that pharmaceutical companies were spending much too much money on R&D. There was too much risk and too little production in that area. So they wanted us to cut our R&D budgets substantially and give the money back to shareholders through the forms of dividends and stock buybacks. And I can't lie, there was a lot of pressure. Actually, my company had 5 years of EPS guidance, of which 3.5 years remained when I became CEO. So in order for me not to cut the R&D budget, I had to withdraw our long-term EPS guidance. That was not an easy thing to do. I remember calling my board 25 days into the job and saying I intended to withdraw the guidance. And the board had a complete fit. They're like, wait a minute, this is a promise we've made to our investors. Who are you to show up and withdraw that promise? But I knew for sure that if we were going to say we were a science-based company, if we were going to say our value as a company was scientific excellence and translating that science into medically important products, the most important of all constituencies that I would ever have in that company would be the scientists who worked in the company and the scientists that we hope to recruit in future years to that company. Because the value in a company like Merck is really high value science. And you can't do high value science if you don't have dedicated quality scientists. So for me, it was one of those trade-offs between doing what investors would favor in the short run versus doing what the company needed to be successful in the long run. And it really helped to have as a mentor and as a role model and a sponsor, someone who'd been very successful. And so I knew I was going to get criticized. I got terrible criticisms. People said, hey, this lawyer doesn't know what he's doing. But because Dr. Vagelos would say to me, that's the right thing, it gave me much more confidence.
So in fact, your strategy was, and I quote, to enable good science.
Yes.
Now, what's interesting is if we fast forward to the time of COVID, the saying "follow the science" became very prominent, and this notion of "follow the science" became actually a political divide, where some people didn't want to believe science, other people wanted to do whatever the science told them. So. Tell us how was it? I mean, Merck obviously was involved heavily in racing to market with a COVID vaccine, ended up producing a COVID vaccine rather than coming to market with its own. But just can you reflect on the craziness of how COVID became a polarizing element in society rather than one where we all seem to come together with common purpose and do what was sensible for each other?
I'll start by saying the single most disappointing thing about my tenure was that the platforms that we employed in seeking a COVID vaccine ultimately were not successful. And we ended up, I think, doing the right thing, manufacturing Johnson & Johnson's COVID vaccine, which is like a consolation prize for a science-based company like Merck. But to get to the core of your question, I think that we have to start by talking about the huge divide that we have in our society around political issues and around societal perspectives. I think that got compounded by the fact that COVID hit us all of a sudden. It forced us into our own houses and caused fear in our society of even, we human beings are social creatures, but we created an environment where people were afraid to interact with one another. And of course, it had huge economic impact on our country, on individual families, et cetera. And I think the point about science here was this was a disease that we were not familiar with. And so we were constantly learning about the disease. We all remember how originally we would wipe everything down when we came in the house from the grocery store because we didn't even know how the virus was being transmitted, right? So we were learning, and we were learning about masks, and we were learning about social distance. And often the things that our public health authorities told us in the short run turned out not to be exactly right. And people not understanding that that's the way science works. I mean, what science does is over time, it discards the prior paradigm about what we believe to be true. But when you're in the middle of a pandemic and you're discarding one paradigm and going to another, and then another and another, it causes people to say, those guys don't know what they're talking about. And the Centers for Disease Control, which before COVID was the gold standard for public health globally, has now lost a huge amount of its credibility with the American public, because it was learning as it went along, and a lot of the earlier advice turned out to be wrong, but also because unfortunately, in our political world, many people seized on those learnings and turned them into a political football. And it's unfortunate, but it's a critical lesson that we've learned about how do you communicate with people when you're uncertain. Don't pretend to know something that you don't know. You've got to be very open about the fact that we're learning as we go along. And I think the CDC is saying that now, but they didn't say that originally, and I think a lot of people have lost trust in them.
That's certainly verifiable in terms of data that have been collected, that we've seen an enormous loss of trust in non-governmental organizations, government organizations, as a consequence of COVID. But
and I just said in my state, there's a senatorial campaign, and one of the candidates who has the most money to advertise on TV, he says he's running for the Senate because he wants to fire Fauci. Now, could you imagine that someone like Dr. Fauci, who spent all of his life in relative obscurity, working at the NIH and the CDC, could actually be featured on a commercial, vote for me and I'll fire Dr. Fauci? It just really shows how politicized the whole situation's become.
I don't think he ever envisioned that in thinking about his career, that he would be featured in that way. But what's interesting is that while everything about COVID became politicized, just as with everything else in our lives has been politicized, that the one group that actually gained trust during this time is the business community, largely because they didn't act too quickly, perhaps, in giving advice, and people trusted that business leaders would be looking out for the best interests of their employees. And so two things have happened as a consequence of COVID. One is business is now the most trusted institution in society. The second is the expectations around business leadership have changed dramatically, where people expect business to play a more active role in society. And starting with, they want businesses to weigh in on vaccine hesitancy, as an example. The list goes on from there to things like racial equity, climate change, and so on. But let's start with vaccine hesitancy. Your views on how we deal with this issue in a way that doesn't increase the polarization in society.
So I think the first thing that I would say about this is that the challenge we have with the ready access we have, particularly through things like social media to information, is that there is a fair amount of misinformation and disinformation that's made available to people. And I think that is a challenge. And I think we've seen some of the social media companies try to address that a little bit late, but that is a factor. I think the second thing, though, is, and inside our company, we're a vaccine company, but we have manufacturing plants all over the United States. And we've had vaccine plants, and particularly in the South, where we had employees who were extremely hesitant to take vaccines for whatever reason. Maybe they heard misinformation or disinformation. But the fact of the matter is, we wanted to say to them it was a condition of employment at Merck to get vaccinated. But we needed to do that in a respectful way. We needed to give people enough time to process the information. We couldn't say to people, you're stupid or you're, not thoughtful. We just had to listen to people very carefully. We had a person who was, fortunately for us, we had a person working for us, Dr. Julie Gerberding, who used to run the CDC. And we sent her to every plant site to do face-to-face meetings and to hear people's concerns and to express back to them that we understood their concerns, that we acknowledged what appeared to be true to them about the situation. But nevertheless, we needed to make sure that people understood that this was really about protecting the next person. So the analogy that sometimes could be used is, when we say we can't smoke in public places, it's not just for the smoker's benefit, it's for the benefit of everybody around them. And as we tried to help people understand that, I think people did come around to it. But I want to come back to the fundamental point. It doesn't help when people who consider themselves knowledgeable talk down to people who they consider to be less educated or less knowledgeable. All that does is push people back into a corner where they personally identify with a point of view, and they're not willing to change it.
So I'm going to jump back in time to non-pharmaceutical questions here. I want to go back to 2017 and Charlottesville. And you were horrified by what you saw happen. You were horrified by the non-response from the administration around the events in Charlottesville. And I'm going to quote just a little bit of the statement that you made as a consequence, which is, I am resigning from the President's American Manufacturing Council. And then a bunch of stuff. And then the last thing I'll read is, as CEO of Merck and as a matter of personal conscience, I feel a responsibility to take a stand against intolerance and extremism. So the question is that last bit that I read, was it personal or was it Merck that you were representing when you made this decision?
It's an excellent question. And let me answer it directly by saying, my main motivation was personal. When the president asked me to serve on his business council, it was a personal challenge for me to join because of how divided our society was, And I visited the president 2 or 3 times, and by coincidence, I was always seated next to him in the pictures. And, my daughter, who's a computer engineer out in Silicon Valley, would call me all the time. She said, "You're killing me, Dad. Everybody knows you're my father." And, but that's how divided our country was. You couldn't go and serve the president of the United States without being accused of having views that I didn't have. So when the president made his statement, I felt like that required me to articulate my values. That to stay silent was to endorse what had been said. In my company, I'll say, there were lawyers and PR people who said, okay, you should step off, but do it silently. You don't have to put out a statement. I didn't think that was the right thing to do. And so eventually I wrote a statement and I called my board. And I said to them, I'm not asking your permission to step off the president's council. I'm going to do that, okay, because of my own personal conscience. The question I put to you is, do you want me to speak to my own personal values, or do you want me to also speak to Merck's values? And I am very proud to say that the board unanimously said No, we want you to speak to the company's values, not only to yours. So the fact that I spoke on behalf of Merck and myself, that Merck part, I had the authority of the highest group enabled to work to comment on behalf of Merck, which was the Merck board. They could have said, say it on your own, but they said, we want you to speak to the company's values.
Interesting. So, did you talk to any other members of the council before you made your decision? Did you think that everyone else was going to resign after you resigned?
So I did not speak to anyone else on the council before my decision. The president's comments were made, I believe, on a Saturday afternoon. I wrote the statement on a Sunday, and I put out the statement the first thing on a Monday. I was not trying to get other people to comment. Many of my peers criticized me for not reaching out to them because some people felt that the council should either act in unison or not. I don't agree with that. I still don't agree with that. I think one has the right to make a decision based on one's conscience, and one takes the heat for it. I mean, I was the first person to step off, so there was reprisal from the president aimed at me. And I knew that was coming. And so for me, that was not something that I felt like I needed to get other people's opinions on. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think that I don't regret it. I was worried about the impact that it could have on my company because the government is our biggest customer. I also knew that many of my employees would not agree with it. But sometimes the issue calls you and you have to do what you think is right.
So in fact, President Trump was not happy with your decision. And so how did you handle what could have been very negative consequences for Merck as a consequence of your decision?
So the first thing was that I was never going to say anything publicly about it. I had calls from all the media. People said, can you come on the show? Could you talk about it? Could you put out another statement? Can I interview you? I had nothing to say about it. The president put out his 2 tweets criticizing me by name, criticizing the company, saying, now that you've gotten off the business council, maybe we could talk about Merck's prices for its drugs. You know, I didn't want to put the company in that position. But as I weighed the 2 sides of things, I really thought that I needed to speak to what I believe was right in that situation, but not make it worse afterwards by looking like I needed attention.
Were you gratified to see that the other members also resigned, or was that really just a non-factor for you?
It wasn't a factor at all when I made the statement because I didn't know what the consequences would be later on. And I did get criticized, I'll be honest. Some of my friends called me and said, we think you're a grandstander. Okay. And what I said to some of those people who I was closest to is, your going on that committee in the first place probably didn't cost you as much as it did me. And I'll just tell this quick story. At that time, my son was a junior in college, and he didn't hang around the house very much in those days. But when the statement came out, my wife and I came back from a visit in New York, and we came home, and my son was home. And I came in the house, and he said, did you see what the president said about Charlottesville? Now, all his friends know that I'm on the president's business council too. So he said to me, and this is what passes for really searing inquiry from a 20-year-old. He said, okay, Dad, what's up? What's up? Okay. Which was his way of saying, all this stuff you talked about when we were growing up about doing the right thing, we're watching. Okay. And so stepping off had real implications for the company, but it had real implications for me and my family.
So there's a lot packed into what's up.
Right.
So I'm gonna flip things around from your role as CEO to your role as a board member and talk about Russia and Ukraine. So Exxon has taken a very public stand in terms of pulling out of Russia. How hard, how complicated is it for Exxon to take that stand? And is that something that the board has to weigh in on?
So the question, to answer your question, is the board did weigh in on it. The other answer to your question is it is extremely complicated. It's extremely difficult. And it cost a lot of money for the company to take the position that it took. And I'll just make a comment about the generality of taking a principled position. The reasons that are often given for not doing it are those three. This is complicated, it's really hard, and it's going to cost us money. Those are the three reasons that most people argue for not taking a position that you may believe is the right position. In this instance, I will just make the point that the investment that we have in Sakhalin 1, which are the oil producing platforms in the North Pacific, are the single largest foreign investment in all of Russia. The other thing that I will say is you may have seen other oil and gas companies very quickly saying they were withdrawing. Exxon is the only Western company that operates in Russia as opposed to having an equity position for something that Rosneft is operating. So when Exxon decides to discontinue and plans to exit, we have people there, okay? We have to worry about the environment because we're operating those platforms. It's ExxonMobil people, not Rosneft people. So I just want to give ExxonMobil, in my view, credit for really caring about the values that they espouse, because it was not easy for that company to make that decision because of the size and the importance of that investment. The company entered into that deal, the previous CEO entered into that deal with President Putin himself. And it's a huge impact on the company's profitability. It may be complicated in the future for the company as it thinks about its geopolitical relationships going forward. But ultimately, I think the company decided that it wanted to be on the right side of history. And I'll just tell a quick story, okay, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You know, there have been great leaders in the history of the world. One of them is Alfred Sloan, who's the great leader of GM. But you know, it is the case that until December 8th, 1941, when Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States following our declaration of war against Japan, that General Motors actually participated by making a lot of the material that was used by the Nazi war machine. Their Opel subsidiary in Germany. And he was questioned about it. He said, our German subsidiary has to operate as a German company. It is not our responsibility to take sides in disputes. This was after the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Today, people will pretend that they would have all made the right decision. My dad worked for the United Parcel Service. In the early 1960s, my father was proud that the United Parcel Service was one of the first companies throughout the South to say, we won't segregate facilities between Black workers and white workers. Very proud of that. Today, everybody on the call will say, I would have made that decision. But those were really hard decisions to be made at that time. And I just want to give Darren Woods, who's the CEO of ExxonMobil, enormous credit because he knows that this is a hard decision to make, but felt that this was a principled decision that the company needed to make. And I think today, as we're now seeing what appear to be war crimes, as Russia's withdrawing, it's even clearer that companies who are doing business in Russia have to think about whether or not they're on the right side of history and on the right side of humanitarian efforts. I'm sorry to be so direct.
No. So the reality is to be on the right side of history, you sometimes have to do that at great expense to the company, and it's not.
But you must be careful. You must be careful that you're not articulating something that is simply your personal values. And that's why a board is so useful.
That's right. And so this goes back to your statement on Charlottesville. You asked the board how it should be represented, and they let you know that this can be both. And it's not appropriate, perhaps, for a CEO just to do whatever he or she wants if they're going to represent that as the company's best interests. So presumably the principle here is to stand up for democracy and sovereignty, and we've seen many other companies do the same thing. Probably Exxon is at the top of the list in terms of the amount of sacrifice that implies in terms of their profitability and the difficulty of the decision.
But my company, Merck, has been criticized. And why have we been criticized? Because if you look at, Professor Sonnenfeld at Yale has a list of companies, and he's giving them grades A to F. All the pharma companies got a D. Why? Because we take the position that we are obliged to not withhold essential medical care. So Merck's position is we're going to continue to supply patients within Russia's borders with essential medical care, because to not do that would be violating another set of principles. And I will just point out, there have been articles about Ukrainian battlefield surgeons operating on Russian soldiers for the same reason. They feel it's their duty. It's the Hippocratic Oath, okay? So I disagree with Professor Sonnenfeld, who I have enormous respect for, because we're in a situation where if we are actually selling anything other than essential products, then I would say we're in the wrong. And by the way, even with respect to essential products, we've made it clear that we will donate all profits to humanitarian causes. We will make no profit over what we do in Russia. Mm-hmm. But we feel if someone has cancer in Russia, that we're not going to stop supplying them with Keytruda, which is our medicine for cancer, as a way of demonstrating our support for democracy and sovereignty, as you said.
Right. So if you'll bear with me, where I'm going with this is that there are companies that have been giving different grades in terms of what they've done with Russia. But there doesn't seem to be controversy that this is appropriate for businesses to weigh in on this issue, to go outside of the scope of our job is to maximize shareholder value. We're going to take a hit on shareholder value because we need to do what's right. So now let me switch from those decisions about Russia to questions about democracy in the United States, where this has been much more controversial. And of course, you and Ken Chenault have been very involved in voting rights issues in different states. A number of CEOs, a number of companies have weighed in against legislation that restricts voting access, and they have been received less warmly, shall we say. So help me understand what's going on here in terms of our stand for democracy.
So I think, first of all, the situation in Russia and Ukraine is so very different. It is, you said right, it's democracy and sovereignty. It's not just democracy. There are a lot of governments in Asia and Africa, the Middle East, that actually don't have democratic systems of government. And we're not trying to impose onto them that they should all have systems where citizens elect their representatives, right? What we're really talking about is the sovereignty of Ukraine. And we're also talking about the violent destruction of a people. okay? So first thing is, I don't think those two situations can ever be comparable. But to your point about democracy, it is a challenge in our country to take positions with respect to things like voting rights, January 6th, legislation around LGBTQ rights in Florida. And I think the challenge is now you're wading into a situation in our country where people have legitimate different views on the underlying issue. With respect to the position that we took and had 700 CEOs and other business leaders sign a full-page ad, if people go back and read what we said in that ad, I would say, frankly, it would be hard for anybody on either side of the political spectrum to disagree with what we said we stood for. Because we only said we stood for essentially two things. The first of which is we believe that people who are registered, eligible voters should be able to vote without undue interference. I think that's pretty anodyne. We also said that we think that elections should be run in a way where they have legitimacy. And so we don't want people to cast votes who don't have a right to cast votes. That's pretty much what we used to be taught in the old days when they taught civics in school. The challenge is that when you take a statement about that, and I just want to make one more point. I was actually interviewed on CNBC, and I went out of my way to say there were aspects of the Georgia law that were good, that were better than the laws in New York. There are aspects of that law that I think are bad. And I said, I have a simple test. Does a provision of the law make it harder to vote without in any way making the outcome more reliable? To me, that's the test. And we've gotten, fortunately, many CEOs of companies, and importantly, I thought this was very important, the largest asset managers in the United States, the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, to sign on and say, we support the stuff that we were taught in civics. Now, we got lots of blowback, right? Mitch McConnell came out and said, CEOs should stay out of politics. I think it's a ludicrous statement because after that ad ran, the Washington Post wrote an article about me in which they pointed out that I had given more to Mitch McConnell than any CEO in the United States because I'm a drug company CEO and I support the positions that Mitch McConnell and his colleagues have taken on issues that are germane to our company. So when people say stay out of politics, I mean, nobody really wants businesses to stay out of politics. We raise a lot of money for people on both sides of the aisle. What they're really saying, stay out of this particular issue because you came in on the wrong side of it.
Is it confusing to, as a result of this, to have so many CEOs weigh in on this issue and then have the Republican Party essentially lash out at the business community and start a campaign that says, you know, all these businesses are woke. And you may have seen the Disney editorial that just came out. Disney goes for woke. Mm-hmm. What is going on here? Is it a fair criticism to say companies are really getting out of their business into someone else's business, interfering in politics, or do you? I mean, you must disagree given the actions you've taken.
I disagree, but I understand how people could make the counter argument. Because I just want to be clear, I don't think that because I was the CEO of Merck, it was my business to tell people what to think about political issues. I'll come back to the voting rights issues. I actually don't see those as political issues. Personally, I thought about it a lot, okay? Before this election and before the arguments were being made about the most recent presidential election, saying that there was massive fraud, the statements that we put in that statement, the statements that we put out about voting rights, I would say everybody would have agreed with, 100%, right? I said they're anodyne statements, right? If you're registered to vote, you should be able to vote without undue interference, right? The word undo is important. I'm a lawyer. We didn't say without interference because you have to be able to legitimize each person who's casting a vote, right? But at the same time, you don't want to have a situation where you're making it hard for people who want to vote because they're working during the day. You don't want to make it harder for them to vote at a convenient time. I understand why people on the other side of this issue are attacking business for being woke. But I still think at the end of the day, society, you've seen the data, 8 out of 10 people say that they expect CEOs to take positions on these kinds of issues, right? Now, of course, they're believing the CEO will take the position on their side of the issue when they answer that question. And it's interesting because there's data about Gen Z, and it's like 90% expect companies to take a position on these issues. So I think that you saw in the Disney situation, they're getting attacked for being woke. But if you went back to the beginning of that, their CEO's initial position is, we're not getting in this. We're staying out of political issues. The challenge he faced was his employees had an uprising. Disney employees had an uprising. And they said, we don't think the position that you're taking here is consistent and complementary with what we believe as a bunch of people here at Disney and what the company under your predecessor said it believed in.
So you've got us in a fascinating space here, which is we've seen the same data around employees expect their companies, their CEOs to take action on a huge range of issues. It's 80% that want their companies to take action. At the same time, those same employees say, but don't take us into anything that's political.
Right.
And so this is the big challenge. So for voting rights for you, your argument is it's not political, although others cast it that way. Bob Iger actually came up with a statement not that long ago around what was happening with Disney, as the former CEO, saying it's not about politics, it's about what's right or wrong. And so my question to you is, how do you thread this needle where the expectation is from your employees that you will weigh in on these social issues, and yet these social issues invariably are politicized? How do you win?
So I don't know that there's any way that you can win with everybody in a highly divided society. But my personal view is you need to be very careful about how often you weigh in on these issues. And you have to ask yourself honestly whether the position that you're taking really is consistent with the company's values. And the way that I try to do that is I try to talk to my senior team about the issues. And by the way, because people know what my politics are, I expect them to sort of skew towards my politics. I use my general counsel, frankly, as the truth teller. And I would say to my general counsel, am I missing something here? Does the team feel like I'm going out there as an individual and not articulating the company's policies and principles? I will tell you on the Trump thing, I think I mentioned that I got advice not to say something public. They said you don't have to do a noisy withdrawal. You can send a private letter to the president saying, I don't agree with what you said, and I'm withdrawing. But to put a statement out on Twitter, you're inviting the wrath of the president and the president's party. I want to tell you a story that actually Bob Woodward has in his book about this. After that statement was made, and after the president was irate, I got calls from the senior-most people, Republican leadership in the House and in the Senate, to say, we agree with the position you took. Now, we can't say that publicly, but the position that you took is the right position. The reality of the world, I said to one of my friends, we were talking about this. He happens to be a graduate of one of the military academies, who called me up and said, That's not your job. I said to this person, how many of your alums died on the battlefields of Europe because we were opposed to what that swastika stood for? You really want to tell me that it's political? Maybe you're political. And he said to me, I'd never thought about that. As a graduate of this military academy, you make a good point. Many of my predecessors died on those battlefields because we're totally opposed to what that swastika stood for. And so I know that I have to be careful not to get on my high horse, but I also have to be careful not to be afraid to take a position when I think that something is happening in our society that speaks to our worst instincts as human beings.
So, there with a platform comes responsibility. The challenge is that as you've used that platform, as you mentioned, your employees have not always agreed with you. So what have you done to keep your employees on board when what you've said publicly may be out of sync with what they believe?
So again, the first thing is to show your respect for those people. My internal communications after Charlottesville, for example, and my internal communications after January 6th, I made a point to say, I know that not everybody agrees with me. And after Charlottesville, I actually traveled to one of our manufacturing plants in Virginia, in rural Virginia, and had a town hall with the employees and said exactly that, which is, my job is not to tell you what to believe about politics. You're entitled to your political views. I want to hear your political views, but let me be 100% clear. Because I'm the CEO of Merck, it doesn't mean that I can't take a position if it's really important to me. And I think what happens, and this is what's really important about our conversations in our society, if you come to people and start by saying, I respect your point of view, even though it's different from me. If you say, I have no right to judge you, I have no right to blame you, people will then give you more latitude. My employees, none of them failed to understand why Ken Frazier had a position about the Klan. They can look at me and see why I have a position on the Ku Klux Klan, right? They didn't have any problem with that. They just wanted me to understand that Donald Trump represented to them things other than the statements he made about Charlottesville. In other words, they wanted me to say to them what I said to them, which is, I don't judge you. I don't think you're ignorant. I don't think you're a racist because you support Donald Trump. I think he was wrong about what he said about Charlottesville. And that creates an opportunity. And the challenge we have in our country and the challenges that we have in conversations like the one we're having is we don't create the space for people who strongly disagree with us to actually say what they believe because they're afraid they're going to be blamed or canceled or whatever the case may be. And I think one of the points about business in the United States these days is if you look at our society, very often we live in enclaves with people that are like us. Our children go to school with those people's children. We go to church or synagogue or mosque with people who believe what we believe. We can tune into media, including social media, where the points of view expressed are exactly our points of view. Business is one of the last places in our society where people can't necessarily choose who they work with and associate with. And I think it's really important for business to create an environment where people can say what they believe and not be attacked for it. And I think the leader of the company, by saying out loud, I respect your point of view and I get how you could see this differently than I do. I think the most you can do is try to create that environment in your company where people respect each other.
So one area where, as a society, we've struggled to have these important conversations is around racial equity and justice. And going back to the data around what people expect from their companies, this is an area where they believe they expect their companies to weigh in and make progress on racial equity and justice, and they actually trust their company more than any other group to make progress on this issue. Now, are you optimistic that business can be the kind of the force multiplier to work on these issues, or is your founding of OneTen, is that a stimulant to the business community or a recognition that we need something else to make this really work?
So let me say that I am optimistic about the role of business. I just share with you that at a younger age, I used to teach law school in South Africa during apartheid. And every time I came back from a semester teaching abroad and landed at JFK, the two things that would strike me about this country are, first of all, our stated creeds were different from theirs. But secondly, the role of the private sector in the United States in helping to reinvent this country over and over and over again is so important. I think business has the talent, it has the resources, it has the capabilities of helping to change our country. You asked about OneTen, your audience may not know what OneTen is, but following the George Floyd situation and the unrest that was happening across our country, in the Business Roundtable and the Business Council, CEOs came together and said, what can business do to address the inequity that exists in our society? Inequity in healthcare, inequity in law enforcement. And some of us said, we really can address the inequities around hiring that exist in our society. Because I actually believe that if you want to have a real equalizer in our society, it is giving people access to family-sustaining wages. Just a little bit of data. In the 2020 census, only 26% of African Americans have a four-year degree. And so what companies are saying is, if we take a skills-first hiring paradigm, rather than a credentials-first hiring paradigm, we can actually look at the ability to upskill, hire people to do jobs once they learn those skills that they otherwise couldn't do. Now, if you have that four-year requirement, rock-solid requirement, it affects whites who don't have a four-year degree. It affects Blacks. It affects anyone who doesn't have a four-year degree. But I just gave you the census data. It becomes a structural barrier to African Americans. 3 out of 4 African Americans, it's a structural barrier. And so what we said to people is, how can we work together to start bridging the equity gaps in our country? And by the way, there are like 10 million open jobs in this country where people can't find people. Manufacturers around the country are looking for people to work. And so what we've tried to do is to say, okay, we have 65 companies that have signed up to look carefully at their hiring recs and say, does this job actually require a four-year degree, or can we teach certain skills and bring people into those family-sustaining jobs with opportunities for advancement? I know we're running out of time, but I just want to say to people, my dad had a third-grade education and was a janitor. I believe that the reason that I am the CEO of Merck today is I grew up in a house with a father who got up every day, went down the stairs, went to work, held his head up high, had dignity. And I would follow my father into the bathroom because I was bused to school. So I had to go to school earlier than my peers because I had to get across town to get to school. The enduring memory of my childhood is the smell of my father's shaving cream every morning. And that work ethic made a big difference in my life. And so what I'm saying is, if we want to fix the problems in this country, not just in Black America, but in rural America, we've got to create opportunity. Talent is much more widespread than is opportunity in our society. And that's what OneTen is about.
Well, Ken, we have run out of time, and I have so many more questions, but thank you for reminding people as we close here that there's so much opportunity, but there's a lot of effort that has to go behind opening up that opportunity for all deserving people. And thank you for being a role model for our community as someone who stands up and lives by his values. What you've done is extraordinary in terms of setting an example for others to follow. And so I told you that I wouldn't do a lot of puffery during our conversation, but as we close, thank you for being a true leader of consequence.
Thank you, Bill, and I want to thank all the participants in this discussion for their generous listening.
Be well.
Bye-bye.